Hey, and welcome to a new challenge run. Today we're going to be playing Parasite Eve, a 1998 game that's kind of like if Resident Evil 1 and Final Fantasy VII had a baby before dying in a house fire, and leaving that baby to be raised by David Cronenberg. Parasite Eve is a JRPG adjacent game, and has a combat system with all the things you'd expect from a JRPG from the 90s. Turn-based combat, lots of different weapons with lots of different numbers, fighting a horrible flesh amalgam that's a stand-in for God at the end of the game, random encounters, all that kind of stuff. But Parasite Eve has something that I don't think any other turn-based RPG has, at least not from this era: movement. While you wait for your turn, you have full control over Aya here. You can try to dodge attacks, get out of an enemy's range, or position yourself for your next attack. It adds a surprising amount of depth to the combat, and I'm honestly shocked I haven't seen it in more games. To complement this combat system, each weapon type has three major attributes: damage, range, and speed. Damage and speed are about what you'd expect, but range is shown by this wire sphere around Aya, giving you a nice visual of exactly when you can and can't hit the enemies. This sphere also adds another layer of complexity, because you don't deal damage immediately after pressing the attack button, and enemies are free to move while Aya aims her weapon or reloads. Enemies can and do move outside your attack range during this time, causing attacks to either deal massively decreased damage or miss entirely. There are loads of different guns Aya can choose from, each with different stats and effects. But today, we'll be choosing none of them. Instead, we'll be playing the entire game with only the club. And a few spells, but we'll get into that later. The club is meant to be a last resort weapon, used only if you've run out of ammo. It has terrible damage, terrible range, and a painfully long attack animation. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the run. We start out by going to an opera and are treated to the first of many glorious PS1 pre-rendered cutscenes. The lead singer chick sets a bunch of people on fire with her mind, and Aya immediately goes into cop mode and tries to fight her. This is essentially just a combat tutorial, so all I had to do was run around in circles to avoid the laser and smack her with my club. The opera singer, calling herself Eve, triggers Aya to have a vision and leaves, forcing us to chase her down. I'll be giving you the Spark Notes version of the plot so that you at least have some context for what's going on, but there's a lot that I'm going to be leaving out, because the story is a lot, both in quantity and content. The game is like 60% cutscenes and dialogue, and a lot of the story really doesn't make a whole lot of sense on a moment-to-moment basis. The combat encounters at this point are supposed to be easy to let you learn how to play the game. Get this super nasty cutscene of a rat turning into a not rat. Only a handful of enemies get cutscene introductions, but they're always neat when they happen. In a secret room in the basement of the theater, I find myself my first new piece of armor. Armor is going to be vital in this playthrough, because we have to stand almost inside enemies to hit them. Taking damage is inevitable. Even when not being attacked, Aya will still take damage just by coming into contact with enemies, so anything we can get to mitigate that damage is absolutely necessary. We track down Eve, who goes all freaky mutant witch mode, and have the first of many rematches. This fight is still very simple. She now has two lasers and a melee attack, so I just try to stand directly in front of her, just outside of her melee range while waiting for my turns. By this point, I had leveled up enough to learn the first healing spell, so I can use my turn and a massive chunk of my parasite energy to heal myself. You get spells automatically when you reach certain levels, and unfortunately not a lot of them are very viable, because of how obscenely expensive they are to cast and how short the duration of inflicted effects are. We follow Eve into the sewers, where we find some guns and items to upgrade guns. These can't be used on the club, so we'll just be immediately discarding any we find. The only way we can upgrade the club is by fighting better versions of it later on, or by dumping bonus points into the club's stats. Bonus points are awarded on level up and can be used to increase Aya's AP recharge rate, inventory capacity, or weapon or armor stats. We will be exclusively spending them on weapon stats. At the end of the sewers is the first actual boss of the run, the Sewer Gator. Pretty much every boss in this game has multiple phases. In the first phase, we have to try to run around and attack its tail, which is simple enough. Then in the second phase, we have to attack its head, which is significantly harder because I have to get right up in its giant, fire-breathing gator grill. But it's still the first area of the game, so things are pretty straightforward. After the fight, we're introduced to Daniel, another cop who Aya works with. We hop over to the police station for an introduction to the weapon tuning system. Basically, if you have two compatible weapons or armors, you can use tuning to transfer either the bonus stats or one mod from one piece of equipment to another, destroying the old item in the process. We'll mostly be using tuning to create better armor, and transferring bonus stats from club to club as we progress. With that dealt with, Aya gives the most unhinged press conference in the history of the NYPD, claiming that a witch who was babbling about mitochondria set everyone on fire with her brain, which, yeah, that's what happened, but why for the love of God would you say that to a room full of reporters? The setting isn't urban fantasy or even really sci-fi, it's literally just New York in the 90s. This is the first piece of evidence that Aya is actually just insane. We're then sent to a museum to go talk to a definitely not evil scientist called Clamp about mitochondria, before heading off to Central Park, because the opera singer, who is now called Eve, has a performance scheduled and nobody thought to shut it down since she's now an arsonist/killer. Carsonist? Assassin? It's not important. What is important is that Daniel catches on fire whenever he tries to go into the park, so we don't. So we have a narrative reason to be a lone gunman. Central Park is where the difficulty first starts to ramp up. First of all, there are snakes. They're fast and they inflict poison, which is a massive fucking problem when we have this little health. The heal spell will be used extensively. Around here is where I started abusing the combat mechanics just a little bit. As long as you're in combat, your PE will continuously recharge. So if you can hang around long enough and don't take a lot of damage, say when there's only one weak enemy left, you can just wait around until your PE bar fills and heal as much as you want. It's tedious as hell, but it works. At the theater, Eve turns the entire audience into LCL, and Aya has absolutely nothing to say about her friend and coworker's child being horribly gooified. Evidence that Aya is actually insane, number 2. There are a few other enemy types here, but the only one that's a real problem is the polar bear. They deal way more damage than anything else in the area, having a lunging attack that is unavoidable if I'm not already 10 feet away from it. Oh yeah, and it can shoot lightning, because fuck you. After a while of wandering around, we have our next boss fight, the worms. At this point, I'm level 12 and have unlocked a few more spells. Slow, which is decent against single powerful enemies, but not great. Detox, that cures poison. And Heal 2, which is easily the most useful of the bunch right now. And the only one I'll be using for the fight. Now, the fight itself is not too difficult, but the worms definitely have much more health than anything we've seen thus far. You just have to run up to a worm as soon as it pops up, smack it 1 or 2 times, then run up to another newly emerged worm and repeat. This gives you the most attack opportunities, and ended up avoiding most of their attacks as well. As you kill the worms, one by one, the remaining worms will get larger and start dealing more damage. The last worm is a bit of an issue. It has a massive sweeping attack that hits most of the arena. You can run all the way to the worm's right side and quickly run to its far left side to just barely not get hit, but the timing is super tight and I wasn't able to do it consistently, so I ended up burning through most of my healing supplies. After the fight, we're immediately met with Eve, a carriage, and evidence that Aya is actually just insane, number 3. Eve tells Aya to get into the horse-drawn carriage, and she just does, with no complaints. She's 100% fine taking a romantic Christmas carriage ride with this witch who won't shut up about mitochondria and nucleic domination. This leads to a brief showdown where you just need to smack her while she's floating around the carriage, then not stand directly in the glowy purple damage circle. Halfway through, she gains a melee attack that there's not really a good way to avoid, so I just tanked through it. We drift the horse-drawn carriage, have another vision, then see that Daniel's kid is alive because he wasn't even at the theater. The city's being evacuated because of all of Eve's gooey shenanigans, and we wake up in some random dilapidated apartment with Daniel and a new character, Maida. Maida is a Japanese scientist who's here to deliver exposition and a MacGuffin later. By walking down the road and breaking into a gun shop, we can finally get our first upgrade, Club 2. This is a pretty massive upgrade. It has almost triple the base damage of our current club, and it has a stealing mod on it. With this, Aya will randomly gain items as she attacks enemies. Most of the items are useless to us, ammo and literal junk, but every once in a while she'll nab a healing item, or occasionally even an armor upgrade item. Unfortunately, the steal mod also comes with a pretty massive downside. It halves the club's damage output. There's a long as hell scene at the museum lab where Maida tells us that the big bad isn't in fact a crazy witch opera singer, but actually a sentient mitochondria possessing an opera singer. That is not a joke. That is legitimately the plot of this game. Mitochondria are sentient, and they're pissed about it. After that bombshell, we head back to the police station to find it under attack by Eve's weird mutant creatures. There are a couple new enemies here, and they both suck. There are some mutant dogs, I think? They have a massive AoE attack that annihilates your defenses. There are also spiders who spit webs on the ground that inflict the slow effect. In a normal playthrough, the slow effect is a mild nuisance. Here though? Here it's hell. I have to waste 1 to 2 turns worth of time just trying to get in range of the little bastards, only for them to move out of range before I can actually do damage. Throughout our trek through the police station, we see visions of Daniel's kid following around a police dog. When we get close to where the kid and the dog are, we see easily the most upsetting cutscene of the game, as this goodest of girls changes into a horrible flesh Cerberus. Right before the room with the Cerberus, there's a scientist woman who heals you for free, once. I spaced out and used the heal while running around looting everything and button mashing through dialogue, but if you're not a total dumbass, you can use this to top off your health before the fight. The boss itself is pretty simple, if long. There are 3 heads, each with their own pool of hit points, so it's best to focus on one head at a time. The dog has 4 moves. One of them is an unavoidable AoE attack, so we'll be using pretty much all of our PE on healing spells. It also has a sweeping beam attack that can be consistently avoided by sticking to its left shoulder. Staying to its side also avoids the bite attack. The dog's final ability is also the most problematic. It'll randomly heal itself for 100 HP. I do 18 damage per hit. Luckily, this healing only applies to one of the heads when it's cast, and which head gets healed seems to be random. After the first head died, it seemed to only do the laser and bite attacks. I'm not sure if that's scripted or just good RNG, but I'll take it either way. This fight took just shy of 10 minutes, and the boss fights are only gonna get longer from here. Next up, we have to head over to the nearby hospital to stop Eve from stealing all the sperm. Again, not a joke. The plot of this game is actually just that unhinged. We've got some more new enemy types. Overgrown amoebas that spit poison at you, nasty fly things that barf up big slowing AoEs. Ranged attacks are pretty easily avoided, so they're not too difficult. I did die down in the hospital, and honestly could not tell you why. Enemies were just doing like 5 times their normal damage for absolutely no reason. These little bastards should not be hitting me for 70 plus damage, and even looking back at the footage, I have no idea why they were. The last new enemy type is this thing. It spits brains at you that bounce around the room. The brains count as enemies, and you have to kill them all to finish the fight. I despise this thing with my entire being. When we finally get to the sperm bank portion of the hospital, we find that we're too late. The witch has already absconded with the semen. We also get some hints that Dr. Clamp, the clearly evil scientist from the museum, is maybe a little bit evil. Then there's this kick-ass cutscene of the military sending in fighter jets, and that takes us directly into the next boss fight, against the Brain Spider. This boss only has two moves, a close-range melee attack and a long-range flame breath attack. Definitely not Quelaag here, seems to really like punishing you for getting too close, and I have to be standing directly under her head to actually hit her. So my strategy was to cast slow on the boss to reduce the frequency of her attacks, then just stand there and bonk her as much as possible. Which was working, right up until she backed herself into this corner where I cannot hit her. At which point I just kinda had to sit on my thumbs until she decided to cooperate. After a few minutes, she enters phase 2, where the only difference is that we have a slightly different camera angle. A few minutes later, the bug falls through the ceiling, and Eve gooifies one of the fighter pilots, causing him to crash into the hospital. The goal at this point in the game is to just find Eve, because no one seems to know where she's run off to. Made a quick stop at a random warehouse to pick up some new armor before realizing that I am agonizingly underpowered for this area, and head off to the sewers to actually progress the game. I spent literally an hour in the sewer tunnels killing bats because I forgot that the club is in fact not in the sewer tunnels. Bats are a massive pain in the ass because there's always at least two. They only have one attack, a sonic screech that blinds you, and they're almost constantly moving around. The only saving grace here is the fact that they do extremely low damage. Blind is incredibly annoying. It reduces our range from terrible to non-existent. Outside the sewer tunnels, we get our third and final club upgrade, which nets us an extra 12 base damage. Now, I wouldn't realize this until later, but I've actually severely handicapped myself by destroying the original club. As I mentioned earlier, the steel effect on the second and third club also have their damage output. If I had kept the first club, I could have used a super tool to move the steel mod off of one of the more powerful clubs, but I didn't, so I can't. Super tools allow you to move stats and mods around without destroying items. We make our way into the subway station and find the most obnoxious boss yet, the mutant centipede. Its first phase is already annoying. It can spit out a bunch of poison, which is easily dealt with by using detox. But it also has a spell that blinds us, which is a pretty massive issue, because I have no way to heal blindness, and literally cannot hit the boss while blinded. It takes a couple minutes of trying to evade the blinding attack, then typically having to run around waiting for it to wear off, but at least when I'm not blinded, we can land attacks, unlike in phase 2. In its second phase, the stupid worm breaks up into 4 segments that spin around the arena. You can land attacks kind of consistently by waiting for them to start their attack phase and tanking hits while getting a single attack in of your own. Or you can try to rely on RNG. You can hit the segments while they're rotating around, but you have to target one of the segments adjacent to where you're standing and just hope they rotate in a way that will put your target in front of you. Either way, having lots of healing items is a necessity because you're going to get hurt badly. Aya then finds herself on a bridge and divines that the goop monster from the sewers is going towards the museum. However, we're going to tackle the optional warehouse area first. The main reason to come here in a casual playthrough is to get the rocket launcher that's dropped by the area's boss. We can't use that, of course, but we can certainly use the XP, so we're gonna do it anyways. The only enemies here are powered up spiders and rats, so let's just get right into the boss. The crab was a very welcome change of pace. By just sticking to its claws and following the boss as it circles the arena, you can avoid most of the damage. For the laser attacks, I actually made use of the barrier spell, and turns out it's actually hella good. Very situational, but very good. It soaks up a shit ton of damage, but drains your PE to 0 when it runs out. Between that and having to stay in its blind spot to do damage, this fight was actually incredibly simple. Just took a long time because we do craptastic damage. Now it's time to reenact Night at the Museum. The first 2/3 or so of this arena is just following a linear path and killing groups of pretty manageable enemies. That is, until the roly-poly things show up. I had literal nightmares about these evil bastards. The only way I found to even kind of efficiently deal with them was to wedge myself into a corner and wait for them to charge me so I can get a hit in. I hate them. They have stupid high defenses, and it takes like 5 minutes to kill a single one of them. There's some more lore dropped in the evil doctor's lab. It's mostly just setting up the final boss killing MacGuffin and establishing the fact that the clearly evil scientist is in fact an evil scientist. Now that we're getting towards the end of the museum area, we've got a bunch of bosses that are going to show up in quick succession. The first one broke me. So the gimmick of the Triceratops is that its first phase has an absurd amount of physical defense. So absurd that I was doing literally 1 damage per hit, and was hitting maybe 3 or 4 times every minute. 10 minutes in, I decided to check the wiki to see if I was missing something, and hell fucking no. I am not sitting here for 2 hours slowly taking off 750 points of damage off this stupid thing. I reloaded a save and ground out a couple levels off camera till I got the ultimate spell, Liberate. It shoots 7 projectiles of magic damage that randomly target enemies. It uses your full PE bar and leaves Aya stunned for a few seconds, so using it is very risky. These final fights are 100% the reason that this is a no guns run and not a club only run. This is already by far the worst challenge run I've ever done, and I'm not beating this stupid dinosaur to death for 2 hours. So after the grinding, the spell nukes the Triceratops' first phase, and it does its phase transition while Aya is stunned, so we can go right back to beating it to death with our stick. Its second phase doesn't have the charge attack, so we can actually hit it when it stands still for the lightning attacks, and it goes down with little issue. After we kill it, the Triceratops comes back from the dead for just long enough to bop us down to the first floor, where it dies for realsies. And we're straight into the next boss fight, the gooey fleshy T-Rex. I have to be standing directly in front of it to hit it, so we have to do as much damage as possible as fast as possible, and heal only when necessary. I ended up burning through all of my healing items and one of my 2 revives, which isn't great, especially considering what's coming up, but it does eventually go down. Now for the final confrontation with Eve. I got my shit kicked in by this fight. Like a lot. The problem is the grab attacks, specifically the one that takes you down to 1 HP. With Aya's glacial move speed, it's near impossible to dodge the grab attacks while trying to remain in melee range. It's also incredibly difficult to actually hit Eve with the club, as she tends to scoot just outside of my attack range. I eventually was able to whittle down the first phase with Liberate, only to get stun-locked to death by your second phase, so I decided to do a bit more grinding to give myself a bit of an edge. I don't know how long I spent grinding, because I forgot to actually turn on the timer for a lot of it, but I know it was longer than 2 hours, and I may have overdone it just a bit, going from level 35 to 49. We went from being decimated by almost all of Eve attacks to taking single-digit damage from just about everything she can do. Now, taking out her first phase in melee would definitely be possible with the amount of damage we're doing, but I was more than 15 hours into a 10-hour game and very pissed about it. So instead I just decided to nuke her first phase with 2 casts of Liberate, and her second phase dies with just 1 more cast. finally allowing us to move on to the actual final boss. A weird baby that turns into chaos from Sonic. Its first phase literally just stands there and lets you smack it. The second phase splits into two creatures. Luckily, you only have to kill one of them. The wings are very fast and never stand still. The crawling bit is still a pain to hit, but liberal use of haste allows us to keep up and whack it to death once it puts itself into a corner. Our defense is so high that the wings don't actually damage us at all, so we can completely ignore them and just focus on the thing we can actually hit. Phase 3 does a lot more damage, but the really scary move, the one that spits out a bunch of high damage projectiles, is easily avoided by casting haste and running up and standing directly underneath him. His other moves are just melee attacks that we can tank through. Its fourth and final phase is really more of a gimmick than an actual fight. It has 8,000 health, and you do a single point of damage per hit no matter what you're using. A little ways into the fight, Daniel hurls himself from the helicopter to give Aya magical MacGuffin bullets that you're supposed to use with Maida's gun, which is an item we were given later and were not able to remove from our inventory, to deal 999 damage per hit. You technically can beat the final boss with the club, and I'm sure someone has or will at some point, but I simply do not have the patience to sit here for like 7 hours slowly whittling away 8,000 points of health. So I did the gimmick and killed Chaos. And that's it. We've beaten Parasite Eve without guns, except for that one very specific instance where the game all but forces you to use a gun. Do not play the game like this. It is actual agony. That being said, if this video gets 50 likes, I'll do the Chrysler Building, which is basically a big-ass Pokemon-style battle tower in New Game Plus, with just the club too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.